What's the easiest way to call turkeys in the springtime? Stay tuned and I'll walk you through it. In this video, we're going to go over 3 different types of calls, and I'm going to show you how I use my favorite. And if you learned something on this video, click that like button. If you want to see other videos like this, click that subscribe button. Now let's get right into this. Let's get into some of the different calls on the market. You got your mouth calls or diaphragm calls. You've got a push-pull call, which is really easy to use, but not quite as versatile as the other calls. And then you got your pot calls or your striker calls. And if you're new into calling, I would stay away from any type of mouth call, at least at the beginning, and use something a little easier. Otherwise, you're going to scare those turkeys in the next county, and you're going to sound something like this. So now that we got mouth calls off the list, you can use a push-pull call, which is a very easy call to use, but it's not as versatile as a pot call or a striker call. The pot call is one of my favorite calls to use, as it's very versatile and pretty easy to use. So let me show you how I prepare my call so that it's ready to use. Let's go over how you condition the surface of this call. I like to use a 100 grit sandpaper for this crystal call, and I rub across the surface going into the same direction. You don't want to go in circles and you don't want to go in several different ways. What you want to do is you want to scratch the surface all in the same direction, so when you run the striker over it, you're creating vibration, which is making the sound. Now, of course, as you're calling and rubbing across the surface, you're rubbing it smooth, so you're going to have to do this every once in a while. The tip of the striker also needs to be conditioned. Most calls, if you flip them over, they're going to have a spot to scuff up the end of the striker. This one has a little stone here that you can put the end of the striker in and move it around and scratch the surface of that also. So now that we went over the surface of the calls and the strikers themselves, let's talk about how to hold the call. So you're not going to want to hold the call to where your hand is across the bottom. You're going to muffle the sound out and it's not going to sound very well. Instead, I like to use my pointer finger and my thumb, and I grip the call as such, and then I use my other hand to hold the striker and rub the striker across. And once you got your surface done and you know how to hold the call properly, we can get into some of the different calls that you would use to try to bring a turkey in. One thing about a striker call, it doesn't mean that you use the striker here and you just hit the call with it. That's not going to work. All you're going to do is go in the woods and sound like a woodpecker beating your head against a tree, and no turkey's going to come into that. Instead, a striker call is a friction call, and we want to create friction across those scratches that we put in the surface. So you want a steady pressure on the surface of the call, and we never want to lift it back up, and we just want to run it across those scratches, and that's going to start creating a vibration, which is going to sound like a turkey. So now let's try to make a turkey sound, which will do a yelp. A yelp, I'm going to use the striker onto the surface, and I'm going to pull in a half circle direction. I'm going to go up in a straight line, and I'm just going to do that over and over again 4 or 5 times. You can change the way that the yelp sounds by pushing harder or lighter on the surface, and then also gripping the striker harder or softer. It will change the pitch and the tone of the yelp. So I want to illustrate on a piece of paper exactly the movement that I'm using the striker in. I'm starting here, constant pressure on the surface of the call. I'm doing a half circle with a little bit of a tail on the end, coming straight up, and I just keep doing this. That's how I'm doing my yelp. Now, one of the most important calls to learn is how to cut. But in order to cut, you're going to have to learn how to cluck. Chickens cluck a lot, turkeys also cluck a lot, and that's just what it sounds like. It's just one sharp cluck out in the woods. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing like we did the yelp. We're going to start up here, and instead of doing that half circle motion, we're going to just pull it straight down in a quick motion and stop and cut it off really quick. Let's illustrate that on our piece of paper. I'm just starting here, and all I'm doing is pulling back in a straight line and snapping the end. So this is the different patterns that we're doing for those different calls. We got this half circle with a straight back, never lifting the striker off the surface to do our yelp. And then here, again, we're never lifting it off the surface. We're just sharply pulling it back with a sharp stop. And we're just doing that for our cluck. And then after you've mastered the cluck, you can start to learn how to cut. We're going to get into a cut. This is an important call to learn out in the woods. It really gets them fired up. You just don't want to overdo it when you're in the woods. But this is a surefire way of getting that gobbler really fired up and also being able to call in hens. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pair together a bunch of single clucks, and it's going to sound something like this. And again, that's just our clucks just in session together, and all we're doing is making a cutting sound. Now that you've learned how to yelp, you've learned how to cluck, and you've learned how to cut, let's put all those together and we can really sound like a turkey. Now that you know how to yelp, you know how to cluck, and you know how to cut, just work on those techniques, put them together, and I guarantee you're going to be successful next time you're in the woods. And if you like this video, click that like button. If you want to see other videos like this, click the subscribe button. And as always, remember to take a kid on an outdoors adventure.